What if the first great economic collapse in history did not begin with modern banks or towering financial institutions, but with a single powerful family who quietly shaped the fate of entire kingdoms? This question is more than a historical curiosity. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that hidden financial manipulation is not a recent invention, but an old pattern that has echoed through every economic era. When we look closer, we start to notice how elite families controlled credit, dictated currency flows, and determined who would rise or fall in the political game long before banks became the centers of global power. Imagine a world where money did not function through regulated systems, but through the influence of those who held exclusive access to trade routes, precious metals, and secret networks of lenders. That world was vulnerable to collapse, not because of randomness, but because all threads of finance converged in the hands of a select few. Their decisions shaped wars, alliances, and entire economic landscapes. And even though centuries have passed, the strategies they use still feel familiar. Debt manipulation, asset hoarding, market distortion, and silent influence over rulers desperate for resources. As we uncover the early blueprint of financial control, the story becomes almost unsettling. The parallels with today's economy are impossible to ignore. Patterns of speculation, cycles of boom and bust, and the concentration of wealth. In small circles, all reveal how deeply rooted these dynamics are. You might even recognize moments in your own life where financial shifts felt sudden or engineered, as if someone behind the curtain was pulling strings you could not see. And that is exactly why this hidden history matters. Understanding how the first great collapse unfolded helps us interpret the mechanisms that shape modern markets, currencies, and global decisions. You may have experienced moments when the system seemed designed to keep ordinary people uninformed while the real moves happened in private exchanges. This narrative will take you deeper into that reality, layer by layer, exposing how old techniques reappear in new forms. What you're about to discover may surprise you, and your perspective on financial power might shift as the pieces fall into place. If any part of this resonates with you or reminds you of something you have felt before, leave a comment sharing your experience, like this video, to help the message reach more people, and check whether you are already subscribed so you do not miss the next insights. And as we follow the trail left by this influential family, another hidden mechanism begins to reveal itself, waiting for us just ahead as the story unfolds. As we move deeper into the roots of this story, the influence of that powerful family becomes even clearer, because their rise did not depend on institutions or formal systems. It emerged from something far more strategic: their ability to control scarcity at a time when scarcity dictated everything. Gold, grain, metals, trade permissions, and even basic necessities could fluctuate overnight depending on who had access to them. This family understood that controlling these levers meant controlling entire regions, and they built their fortune around that simple but devastating insight. While common merchants traded goods, they traded leverage, and leverage in a fragile world was worth more than any treasury. Their operations were not limited to one city or kingdom. They worked through webs of intermediaries, agents, and alliances that crossed borders long before global finance was officially born. They offered credit to rulers who needed armies, supplied resources to merchants who wanted dominance, and manipulated exchange rates between regions that barely understood the mechanics of monetary shifts. Every transaction they touched created a dependency, and every dependency strengthened their influence. It was a system where their wealth did not need to be visible. It only needed to be indispensable. What made their strategy so powerful was the perception of trust they had cultivated. They positioned themselves as the only reliable source of capital in moments of tension, and that image allowed them to impose terms that quietly shaped the political and economic trajectory of entire territories. Behind every war chest, behind every large-scale construction, behind every ambitious kingdom expansion, there was often a silent loan orchestrated by their network, and with each loan came conditions that would ripple through future generations. This dynamic created a pattern that is still recognizable today. Concentration of financial authority rarely appears suddenly. It emerges through gradual control of essential flows. When societies become dependent on a single mechanism or group to sustain their economy, collapse becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The family understood this perfectly. Their wealth grew as regions became entangled in cycles of borrowing, repayment, and renewed borrowing. Because the more complex the web became, the harder it was for kingdoms to operate without them. And the deeper this dependence ran, the more vulnerable the whole system became to a single disruption that could bring everything down. Yet even at their strongest moment, none of the rulers or merchants around them realized how their own decisions fit into a larger scheme. That is the hidden genius of early financial manipulation. It often feels like natural economic movement, when in reality it follows the deliberate pressure of a hand that prefers to stay unseen. And as their influence expanded, the seeds of the first great collapse were quietly being planted, waiting for the precise combination of ambition, desperation, and imbalance to trigger the fall that would shock the known world. What made this family truly formidable was not just their reach, but the subtle mechanisms they perfected to manipulate economic outcomes without ever appearing responsible for them. Their influence grew through actions that seemed harmless on the surface, yet shifted the balance of entire markets. One of their most effective strategies was the strategic release or withholding of resources at crucial moments. By delaying a shipment of grain, metals, or textiles, they could trigger price spikes that harmed rivals and enriched their allies. Market fluctuations that looked like chance were often the result of quiet decisions made behind the closed doors of their estates. Even more powerful was their mastery of information. In a world without rapid communication, whoever controlled the flow of news controlled opportunity itself. This family invested heavily in couriers, informants, and traders who kept them updated on harvest failures, political tensions, secret negotiations, and military plans long before anyone else. With this privileged knowledge, they could lend to the right kingdom at the right moment, bet against regions facing upcoming scarcity, or buy undervalued goods that would soon skyrocket in worth. Every rumor, every whisper, every delay in news became a tool for shaping their advantage. But their manipulation did not stop at information. They understood that currency itself could be shaped in their favor. By influencing the availability of precious metals in certain territories, they affected the real value of coins long before rulers realized what had happened. A region flush with silver today might find itself desperate tomorrow, simply because shipments the family promised never arrived. Such fluctuations forced rulers into dependency, relying on the family to stabilize their treasuries. And each act of stabilization came with new terms, deeper obligations, and greater vulnerability. Their control extended into social perception as well. They strategically funded public works, festivals, and symbolic gestures that made them appear as benevolent supporters of civic life. Meanwhile, their pressure behind the scenes pushed markets into positions that weakened competitors or destabilized rival kingdoms. The brilliance of their method was in the duality, generosity in public, coercion in private. Few suspected that the same family financing a new aqueduct might also be orchestrating the currency shortage undermining the local economy. These tactics created a financial environment where outcomes were rarely organic. Every shift, rise, collapse, and recovery carried the imprint of their involvement. And the most striking aspect of their power was how invisible it remained to the populations affected by it. Kingdoms blamed bad harvests, unpredictable markets, or political missteps, never realizing that the real cause was an engineered pattern designed to funnel influence back toward the same powerful lineage. As their methods evolved and their network expanded, the system they created became increasingly fragile. The smallest imbalance in their calculations could create a chain reaction, and any misstep from their partners could ignite instability across multiple regions. Yet they continued pushing the boundaries of control, confident in their ability to navigate the dangers they themselves had constructed. And with each passing season, the structure supporting their dominance grew heavier, more complex, and far more vulnerable to a single spark capable of unraveling everything. As the family expanded its operations across distant territories, their financial network began to resemble an early form of international infrastructure. They positioned trusted agents in major trading hubs, ports, and political capitals, each one acting as an extension of their will. These agents did more than handle transactions. They monitored local tensions, assessed shifting alliances, and quietly steered markets toward outcomes that favored the family's larger strategy. What looked like independent events were often coordinated movements that aligned perfectly with the broader plan spreading across continents. Their influence reached its peak when they began financing opposing sides of the same political conflicts, lending to one kingdom for military expansion while secretly supplying resources to its rival allowed them to benefit no matter the result. This dual financing system did more than generate profit. It created a dependence so deep that rulers had no choice but to return for new loans, new concessions, and new agreements. Entire regions began to feel as if they were trapped between financial obligation and political survival, and every attempt to break free only tightened the chain. What made this stage of their expansion particularly dangerous was that it amplified the vulnerabilities of the existing economy. Currencies already fluctuating from resource manipulation now faced additional pressure from war spending. Merchants who relied on stable markets found themselves navigating unpredictable shifts in supply and demand, often unaware that these fluctuations were not natural but carefully orchestrated. And the more unstable the environment became, the more kingdoms leaned on the family as a stabilizing force, unaware that the source of stability was also the architect of their volatility. This growing imbalance set the stage for a fragile system where a single failed repayment could trigger repercussions across multiple regions. The family knew this, yet they continued to expand their operations, confident that their position was strong enough to weather any disruption. But beneath the surface, tensions were accumulating. Too many kingdoms owed too much to the same network, and too many markets were interconnected through invisible threads the family had woven. The moment one region faltered, the effect would echo through every territory tied to their influence. Despite their calculated confidence, small signs of strain began to appear. Delayed repayments, sudden drops in regional output, and unexpected shifts in trade routes hinted at deeper issues forming beyond their control. Their agents worked tirelessly to smooth these cracks, but the structure was now far too large and complex for subtle corrections to hold it together indefinitely. What had once been a finely tuned mechanism was slowly transforming into an unstable machine on the brink of reacting to its own weight. And as their influence reached its widest spread, the very networks that had empowered them were now creating vulnerabilities they could no longer manage with precision. The world around them was entering a phase where even minor disturbances could transform into cascading failures, and the regions under their reach were unknowingly standing at the edge of an economic shift that would leave its mark for generations. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of this expanding financial web surprise you the most? The growing tensions surrounding this financial network were not driven solely by economics. Conflicts, rivalries, and political ambitions intensified the pressure building beneath the surface. Rulers who had once benefited from the family's support began to resent the invisible dependence that had formed around them. Every decision they made seemed entangled with hidden obligations, and even minor disputes between territories carried financial consequences that echoed back toward the same powerful lineage. In this environment, alliances shifted unpredictably, each one influenced by a mix of desperation, pride, and the unspoken fear of losing access to the family's resources. Within royal courts, advisors whispered about alternatives, schemes to break free from the debts that had accumulated over the years. Some kings attempted to impose new trade restrictions, believing they could regain control by limiting the family's influence. Others formed secret coalitions, hoping that united resistance would weaken the financial grip tightening around their economies. But these efforts rarely succeeded. The family had already embedded itself too deeply into the infrastructure of multiple regions, and any attempt to sever ties often resulted in greater instability. Traders suffered, markets fluctuated, and populations felt the weight of decisions made far above their understanding. Meanwhile, competing merchant groups viewed the family's dominance as an opportunity and a threat. Some sought to imitate their strategies, trying to build small networks that mirrored the original model. But without the same reach, information access, or political leverage, these attempts often collapsed before gaining real momentum. Other groups chose to undermine the family directly, spreading rumors of manipulation, corruption, and treachery in hopes of turning rulers against them. Though the accusations were not entirely wrong, they rarely had the desired effect. Most leaders remained too financially dependent to take decisive action, and the threats only added friction to an already unstable system. As new conflicts emerged across distant borders, the family found itself navigating an increasingly tangled landscape. War expenditures rose, and kingdoms began making larger demands for credit, materials, and logistical support. To maintain control, the family had to extend itself further, stretching its network to meet the rising needs of regions. Teetering on the edge of chaos, their agents worked day and night to balance the flow of resources, but the imbalance of obligations became more visible with each passing season. Every new alliance, every loan, every shipment of goods added another layer of risk to a system already creaking under its own weight. At the same time, political rivalries among members of the family introduced complications within their own ranks. Disagreements over which territories to support, which rulers to trust, or which investments carried the least danger-created fractures that weakened the precision of their operations. In a system built on calculated coordination, even small internal disputes carried the potential to disrupt entire regions. And while the world around them believed the family remained unified and unstoppable, the truth was that the mechanisms sustaining their dominance were becoming increasingly difficult to synchronize. All these forces combined to create a volatile environment where a single miscalculation could unleash consequences far beyond the family's intentions. Their influence had shaped economies, directed conflicts, and connected distant territories into one interdependent framework. But now, those same connections were forming a chain of vulnerability that could be triggered by events no one had anticipated, and the balance that once sustained their authority was beginning to shift in unpredictable ways. As the system tightened around itself, the first signs of true instability appeared not as dramatic events, but as subtle disruptions, almost too quiet to interpret. A delayed repayment from a smaller kingdom, a sudden shortage of a key resource, an unexpected shift in a trade route that had remained consistent for decades. Individually, each issue seemed manageable. Together, they hinted at an underlying weakness that even the family's agents struggled to explain. These were not ordinary fluctuations. They were signals of an economic structure stretched beyond its natural limits. Rulers who had once confidently drawn from the family's credit began hesitating as the terms of new agreements became sharper and more demanding. They sensed that the family was no longer operating from a position of unshakable security. The tone in negotiations shifted. The unspoken assurance that the family could stabilize any crisis no longer felt as certain. Yet the kingdoms were too entangled in debt and obligations to pull back fully. They lived in a paradox, dependent on the very system that was beginning to weaken. Merchants began noticing irregularities as well. Prices fluctuated with unusual speed, and goods that typically moved smoothly across trade routes faced unpredictable delays. Regions that had always relied on consistent supplies found themselves competing for shipments that suddenly became scarce. Rumors spread in marketplaces about hidden tensions, secret disagreements, and possible fractures in the financial web controlling the flow of commerce. Most people could not name the source of the problem, but they felt its presence in every deal, every exchange, every rising cost. Within the family's private circles, the atmosphere shifted from confidence to urgency. Their agents sent increasingly troubling reports. Certain regions were taking longer to repay loans, some rulers were secretly negotiating with rival lenders, and a few territories had begun imposing taxes and restrictions designed to reclaim authority over their own economies. Each of these actions chipped away at the foundation of influence the family had constructed over generations. And because their network was built on balance, even minor fluctuations carried the potential to destabilize other connected regions. At the same time, external pressures intensified. Conflicts in distant lands disrupted supply lines the family relied on. Harvest failures strained the availability of essential commodities. Political rivalries flared into open hostility, forcing the family to redirect resources just to maintain a fragile equilibrium. Every intervention demanded more capital, more negotiation, more compromises that weakened their leverage. And beneath all these tensions lay a deeper truth. The entire system depended on uninterrupted trust. Once trust began to erode, collapse became more than a risk. It became an approaching reality. The world around them did not yet grasp how close everything was to unraveling. To most rulers and merchants, the disruptions appeared temporary, the kind of turbulence every economy experiences. But those closest to the center felt the tightening pressure, the growing uncertainty, the sense that the connections holding the system together were fraying at multiple points at once. What had once been a perfectly engineered network was now showing signs of strain that could no longer be ignored, and the forces gathering beneath the surface were preparing to reshape the economic order in a way no one was ready to confront. The moment of implosion did not announce itself with a single catastrophic event. Instead, it emerged from a convergence of pressures that had been building unnoticed for years. A key kingdom, strained by consecutive conflicts and mounting debts, finally failed to repay a substantial loan. What should have been a manageable setback instantly exposed how fragile the interconnected network had become. As news of the default spread, among traders and rulers, confidence began to erode and the delicate trust sustaining the entire system started to crack. Merchants who depended on predictable credit lines found themselves suddenly cut off, forcing them to sell goods at reduced prices or abandon trade routes entirely. The sudden shift created shortages in some regions and oversupply in others, triggering price collapses that rippled far beyond their points of origin. Kingdoms that had grown accustomed to borrowing, reinforcements from the family, now faced empty treasuries, making it impossible to maintain armies, infrastructure, or political stability. The shock spread like a physical force, disrupting systems that had functioned for decades under the family's quiet guidance. For the family itself, the collapse hit with an intensity they had not anticipated. Every unpaid debt reduced their ability to offer support elsewhere, creating a chain reaction of halted loans and tightened conditions. Their agents, once symbols of reliability, were now viewed with suspicion or hostility, as rulers questioned whether the family's power had been exaggerated all along. Entire regions that once depended on them started seeking alternatives, even if those alternatives were unstable or dangerously improvised. The financial vacuum generated by the collapse produced political conflicts that escalated with alarming speed. Trade networks that once carried goods smoothly across kingdoms began to fail as intermediaries withdrew from routes now considered too risky. Ships sat idle, caravans halted, and marketplaces grew quiet as economic activity slowed to a near standstill. The consequences extended beyond commerce. Famine rose in areas that relied on imported grain, and rulers faced uprisings fueled by desperation and fear. A collapse that originated in quiet financial halls had now exploded into a full-scale crisis that reshaped social, political, and cultural landscapes. Perhaps the most Revealing part of this downfall was how quickly illusions dissolved. The belief that the system was stable, that the family could withstand any disruption, or that the economic order was natural and inevitable, all disappeared within weeks. People realized that they had never truly understood the forces driving their prosperity or their suffering. The collapse exposed the invisible architecture of power that had guided their world, and once seen, it could not be forgotten. The impact of this implosion extended far beyond the family's immediate sphere. It introduced uncertainty into every region touched by their influence and tore apart alliances that had seemed unbreakable. And as the world struggled to interpret the scale of the damage, the deeper patterns behind the collapse began to surface, patterns that would echo through future ages of finance. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of this unfolding collapse resonates most with you, and why? In the aftermath of the collapse, the world found itself in a state of confusion that stretched far beyond financial loss. The sudden breakdown of trade networks and credit lines created a vacuum that no ruler or merchant was prepared to fill. Regions that once thrived through extensive commercial exchange now faced isolation, unable to move goods across routes that had been reliable for generations. Without the family's stabilizing influence, however manipulative it had been, many kingdoms experienced their first true encounter with economic independence, and the reality was far harsher than expected. Small markets struggled the most. Their prosperity had depended on the smooth arrival of foreign supplies, and now they faced shelves that remained empty for weeks. This scarcity forced people to rethink the value of their own production, but the adjustment came too abruptly for most communities to respond. Artisans lost access to essential materials, farmers lacked buyers for surplus harvests, and cities that once bustled with diverse goods became dominated by whatever items remained locally available. The world contracted, economically and psychologically, as people realized how dependent they had been on a system they never fully understood. Meanwhile, the collapse reshaped political dynamics at every level. Leaders who previously relied on the family's loans were compelled to adopt new strategies for survival. Some increased taxes, placing unbearable pressure on already struggling populations. Others attempted to reclaim control through aggressive expansion, hoping that conquering new territories would secure the resources they could no longer purchase. A few sought to rebuild alliances with neighboring regions, but the deep mistrust left by the collapse made cooperation difficult. The uncertainty bred fear, and fear became a driving force in decisions that worsened the crisis. As the ripple effects spread, traders began noticing an unexpected pattern. While the collapse had weakened every kingdom involved, the damage was not evenly distributed. Regions that had become most entangled in the family's network endured the harshest consequences, while more isolated territories experienced only moderate disruption. This imbalance introduced a new layer of resentment. Some rulers blamed their neighbors for benefiting from their misfortune, while others accused former allies of intentionally distancing themselves to avoid deeper collapse. These tensions fueled conflicts that escalated far beyond simple economic disagreements. Yet, even in the midst of turmoil, the collapse revealed truths that had long been hidden. Merchants and rulers began to recognize the extent of their dependence on external credit, and the illusion of stability created by the family's network began to lose its power. People questioned how a single group had been able to shape the fate of so many regions, and why no one had noticed the warning signs earlier. As information about the family's influence started to spread, a new generation of leaders emerged, determined to build systems less vulnerable to manipulation. But economic recovery was not simply a matter of restructuring trade routes or establishing new agreements. The collapse had rewired the global balance in ways that would take generations to understand. Long-standing hierarchies dissolved, new power centers emerged, and the perception of wealth itself began to shift. And beneath all these transformations, one persistent question lingered. If a single family could trigger such widespread disruption, what would happen when the next group mastered the same techniques, armed with even more sophisticated methods and a far larger reach? As the world slowly emerged from the shock of the collapse, a striking development began to take shape. New financial powers rose from the ruins, studying the failures of the past with meticulous attention. They saw the weaknesses exposed by the collapse not as deterrents, but as opportunities to rebuild influence with greater precision. These rising dynasties adopted the same core principles that had driven the original family's success, but they refined them with broader networks, improved communication, and far more sophisticated strategies for shaping markets. While the world believed it was moving forward, it was unknowingly rehearsing the same patterns under different names. These new players understood that control was not simply about wealth. It was about perception, information, and timing. They invested heavily in trade routes, ensuring they could redirect resources with speed that earlier generations could not dream of. They developed more reliable systems for transmitting news, eliminating the delays that once allowed uncertainty to influence markets. And most importantly, they identified which kingdoms were most vulnerable to debt, cultivating these relationships slowly, carefully, and with a degree of subtlety that concealed their true intentions. The collapse had served as a powerful lesson in what not to do, and they intended to use that knowledge to their advantage. Kingdoms, still recovering from the financial wounds of the previous era, welcomed these new lenders with open arms. Desperation made them eager to accept the promise of stability, and the dynasties were ready to provide it. They offered credit with terms that seemed lighter, more reasonable, more aligned with mutual benefit. Rulers believed they were forging partnerships that would help rebuild their economies, unaware that the foundation of these agreements was designed to create the very dependencies that had led to the past collapse. The illusion of fairness became the new tool of influence. Merchants, too, embraced the revival. Trade routes reopened, marketplaces regained vitality, and goods once again flowed across borders. But beneath this renewed prosperity lay deeper and more complex networks of control, the families. Orchestrating this resurgence used layered agreements that bound regions together in ways far more intricate than before. Currency manipulation took on new forms, credit systems expanded, and the influence that had once depended on physical movement now relied on ideas, trust, and invisible obligations woven into every contract. The most important evolution, however, was ideological. These dynasties understood the value of remaining unseen. Unlike the previous family, whose influence had eventually become too visible to ignore, the new powers operated through intermediaries, institutions, and symbolic gestures that kept their names out of public scrutiny. They built reputations for fairness, stability, and benevolence, even as they shaped the economic decisions of entire nations from behind closed doors. This separation between appearance and reality allowed them to avoid the backlash that had fueled resentment during the earlier collapse. And as the world embraced this newfound stability, it unknowingly stepped deeper into a system that reflected the same vulnerabilities, the same imbalances, and the same hidden pressures that had once brought entire kingdoms to their knees. The old pattern had returned, more polished and more effective than before, setting the stage for future cycles that would repeat with greater impact and reach. As the influence of these rising dynasties expanded, the world found itself shaped by an economic order that felt modern in structure but ancient in spirit. The techniques had evolved, the language had changed, and the mechanisms appeared more sophisticated, yet the underlying pattern remained unmistakably familiar. Debt continued to function as the quiet thread that tied kingdoms, merchants, and entire populations to powers they could not see. Currency shifts still followed the decisions of those who understood how to move markets without leaving fingerprints. And trust, once again, became the fragile foundation on which the global system rested. This new reality created a paradox. On the surface, the world seemed more stable than ever. Trade networks were stronger, communication faster, and institutions more organized. People believed they were living in an age of progress, far removed from the vulnerabilities of earlier eras. But beneath that progress lay a vast architecture of influence that operated according to rules forged long before modern economies existed. The collapse from generations earlier was not forgotten by those who had studied it closely. Instead, it became a blueprint for power, a guide for avoiding the mistakes that had allowed the previous family's control to unravel. As new cycles of prosperity emerged, they brought with them subtle signs that the underlying system was once again accumulating pressure. Markets swelled with speculative growth. Rulers borrowed far beyond their means, and institutions tasked with maintaining stability became increasingly intertwined with private interests. Each development echoed the earlier patterns, though now amplified by scale and speed. The players had changed, but the dance remained the same, driven by the same forces that had shaped the world centuries before. To outside observers, these shifts appeared disconnected, mere fluctuations in a complex global landscape. Yet those who understood the older collapse recognized the rhythm immediately. Influence concentrated in quiet corners, risks spread invisibly through intertwined systems, and the notion of independence faded as kingdoms and economies relied more heavily on networks they did not control. What had once been the work of a single powerful family had become the silent operation of a global structure that followed the same logic, merely strengthened by time. And as this new order settled into place, the question that lingered was not whether history would repeat, but when. The patterns were too precise to ignore, too deeply rooted to dismiss. Every financial cycle carried echoes of the past, and every era seemed destined to confront the consequences of systems built on imbalance. What was once an isolated collapse had evolved into a template that continued to shape decisions, opportunities, and crises across the world. If you stayed with me until this point, leave a comment saying, "History still speaks to us," so I know you reached the end and felt the weight of these patterns as they unfolded. If the insights in this story helped, you see the present with clearer eyes Consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next, and give this video a like to support the work behind these investigations. There is another video here that expands this discussion in a powerful way, so click and continue with me while we explore the next thread hidden within the financial history that surrounds us.